All right, I think I'm just gonna
Yeah, I
get
think we should
away
just
from
start.
here. Yeah. So hi everyone. Welcome to this Leaky Deltas webinar. Before we get started with our speakers, I just want to give a quick introduction to why we're doing this webinar series and talk about the workshop that we're planning for March of 2025. And so here's some information on this slide. So we're having a workshop in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, hosted at LSU. And the goal of this workshop is really to work towards quantifying the role of deltas in the global carbon cycle. And so we'd love to bring everyone in the delta research community together and talk about what the big questions are, where should we navigate our research, and hopefully facilitate new collaborations. So if you have not yet applied to attend the workshop, you can do so at OCB's website. We have a link to apply for the workshop. And it will be a selective application process. So we're reviewing applications and yeah, we would love to see yours in there. So today's webinar, we are happy to have Muriel Bruckner from Louisiana State. And then that will be followed by Anastasia Pillouras from Penn State University. And they'll be talking a lot about the ecogeomorphic feedbacks in deltas, as well as how delta morphodynamics can influence land-ocean fluxes. And so we'll get started with Muriel in a few minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A after her talk. And then we'll hear from Anastasia, and then have a Q&A that goes from about 9 to 9:20. So if you have to jump off at 9, totally understand, but would love if you could stick around for questions at the end. All right, so just before we get started with those talks, we have a poll that we're going to run just to, as a little icebreaker, to get to know you and sort of solicit feedback in the Delta community. And I think May is going to post the link to this in the chat. So I'm going to swap over to present this poll. All right, so give everyone a chance to log on to that Menti poll. You can join at menti.com and enter the code 29895. And so our first question is, where do you work? Where are your research sites? So I think a lot of us work all over the world, hopefully, on river deltas and carbon cycling in those deltas. Love to see where you work. So populate that up. Looks like we've got someone on the Mackenzie Delta, perhaps, in Canada. Gulf of Mexico, I have quite a few researchers. Europe. Awesome.
Do you want to share that presentation screen, Marissa?
Oh, yes, I would love to share the presentation screen. It's like you all can't see what I'm seeing.
Perfect. Thanks.
There we go. All right, so a few folks in Europe and someone on the East Coast of the US as well, or Canada. Awesome. Great. So yeah, the goal of our workshop and these webinars is to really bring together folks who are working on deltas all over the world, because they're all different and we can learn about different processes by studying these different deltas. We've got someone from the Amazon. Fantastic. might head to the next poll question. Thank you all for responding to that one. All right, and one of our goals is also to bring together people from different career stages. So please let us know what your career stage is. Are you a grad student, postdoc, early career, mid-career, or been working on deltas your whole career and you want to share your experience with us? Lots of early career folks. Great. Some grad students, awesome. All right, I think I'm going to move to the next question. All right, and this is one that's kind of more open-ended. So we want to hear from you what you think is one big scientific unknown in the field of delta carbon cycle research. So please let us know what you think, and those responses will populate here on this slide. All right, we have a couple of responses in. So someone said estimating vegetation species changes and how that might affect carbon capture by those species over timescales of decades to centuries. Are deltas a source or sink of carbon to the atmosphere? Yep, that is a big overarching question that we're hoping to work toward answering. Mass balance, yep. That is critical for carbon and all the other, everything else. Chemical and physical feedbacks, yeah. And so, the last few webinars, we had 3 in the spring, and those were mostly focused on biogeochemistry and ecology. And today we'll hear more from geomorphologists. So the goal is to, link those physical and chemical feedbacks. Effects of flocculation of riverine organic matter. Yeah, that's important for understanding where the carbon is transported. Sedimentary dynamics coupled to biogeochemical cycling. Awesome. And how land use might increase sequestration or decrease by mobilizing carbon. Awesome. These are all great, and we will save these responses and use them in our workshop to help guide some of our sessions. All right, so for the sake of time, well, thank you everyone for answering these polls. It's really great to hear from the community, but I think we should get going with our speakers. So I'm going to close out of here and I'm going to stop sharing. And I think I will let Muriel Bruckner take it away. So feel free to start sharing, Muriel.
Can you also see my screen?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Can you also see my pointer?
Yes, I would move your mouse a little bit slow because it doesn't track perfectly.
Okay, that's a good point. I'll try to remember that. Yes, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Muriel Bruckner. I am an assistant professor at LSU, Louisiana State University. And I just started working recently on deltas. So when you just asked the question of if I'm early career or like a grad student, I feel more like a grad student when it comes to delta research because my background is in estuaries and biogeomorphic feedbacks in estuaries. And so today I'm going to talk about my ongoing projects that are kind of still some preliminary results. And that is mainly about ecogeomorphic feedbacks in deltas and understanding what the role is of organic and inorganic processes in shaping the morphology of deltas. So at the top here, we have several examples of deltas, and I think you're familiar with some of those, but I'm mainly going to talk about Wexlake Delta, which is this delta here, the third delta from the left. I would also like to acknowledge my collaborators. This is work that's been done in collaboration with my collaborators at UT Austin and LSU, and some of my students that have also been working with me on some of the things I'm going to present today. So Wexlake Delta, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Here in Louisiana, it's like the delta to study. It's the one here in the satellite image in the white rectangle. And it's located in the Mississippi River Delta, so in the Gulf of Mexico. And that delta is quite unique because it's been recently growing. So this is satellite imagery from 1984 until 2017. And you can see that in these 40 years, it would just, it grew very quickly. So this delta is very young, and basically we can observe in real time how a delta forms and how it gets colonized by vegetation, which is why it's an ideal study site to assess delta formation. And I think about the morphology, so that means the large scale shape of estuaries, of deltas, how many channels we have, bars, where do we have vegetation. And we know from Jaap's work that, and others, that the shape of deltas depends on the river discharge, on the waves and on the tides, and the related sediment supply of each of those sources. And so that results in different forms of deltas, which can be either tide dominated, if there's a low sediment supply associated with them, and or rapid sea level rise, or as in the case of Wexlake Delta, we have very high sediment supply rates, and we get these nice protruding delta formation outside of the coast. And so when I look at this, I think this is great. These landforms, I find them pretty fascinating, but what I find even more interesting is that this is all marsh. And so marsh is something that hasn't been popping up so much in the geomorphology of deltas yet. And I'm very interested in understanding how vegetation affects the different types of deltas and how it mediates the hydrodynamics in deltas, but also sediment supply, and then associated carbon and nutrients as well. And we know that vegetation is the driver of delta morphology because vegetation kind of settles on intertidal areas or in areas that are flooded regularly, but are usually not submerged 100% of the time. And so they have a frictional effect on the flow. So they will slow down flow velocities, and that will cause deposition of sediment, and will also cause deposition of organic materials. And so there's this inorganic component, which is the sand and mud coming from the discharge of the river or from the ocean. But we also have this effect of organic accretion, where vegetation produces a biomass through roots or just through above ground litter production. And that material will settle on the ground and will also enhance bed elevation, so change the morphology locally through these organic accretion. And that leads to quite interesting patterns. I'm coming from estuaries. This is an island in a delta, just an idealized island. And if you compare this with estuaries, you have a different vegetation pattern and also different morphology, which I first thought was very interesting, because in deltas, most of the sediment comes from the river, or at least in river-dominated deltas. And so most of the deposition occurs at the tip of the islands towards the apex of the delta. So in this area, and that leads to a gradient of bed elevation towards the inner island, and therefore also a colonization of vegetation. So we have a gradient of larger and more denser vegetation that are like later successional stages. So for example, here, willows are one of those that also can be found in Rex Lake Delta. And if we go into the inner island, those vegetation becomes less dense and smaller. And so that is this red line here. So from the top of the island towards the sea. And so the similar thing happens when you look at the cross section. So we have again higher elevations because of sediment deposition here at the outside of the islands, and then towards the inner islands we get usually lower elevations with different vegetation species. And so that affects how we get sediment supply towards the inner islands, but it also affects the organic accretion by these different species, because different species will have different organic accretion rates because they have different production of biomass. And so that is something that affects the channel island connectivity in deltas, because once we have the vegetation that settles on these outer levees, we don't have as much exchanges anymore between the main channel, where most of the sediment and nutrients are transported, and the inner islands. And so it becomes very quickly kind of complex to assess in which areas do we now have control by organic accretion or a control by inorganic sediment supply from the channel or from the sea, because we have to acknowledge that once we have vegetation, we kind of block the flow from the outer channel into the islands. So these are three broader research questions that I'm currently working on. One is, how and where is vegetation the main driver of morphology in deltas? And how can we model vegetation establishment and growth in deltas the best way? And then following from that, what vegetation species will be the most important ones in deltas when we think about how they help us accrete materials and raise bed elevations to reduce flood risk. And so we are looking at this from this connectivity perspective in deltas. So we do have the vegetation and the water levels that control connectivity. So basically, I look at two different scenarios. One is high connectivity and one is low connectivity. And high connectivity would mean that we have high discharges coming from the river, which raise the water levels, and therefore there's a higher chance that the water can enter the islands. And at the same time, that correlates with there being lower vegetation density as well. So while we have higher water levels, the vegetation will also allow more water to enter the islands because vegetation density is lower. While on the low connectivity scenario, it's the opposite. We do have a low discharge, but we have high vegetation density. And that classification comes from the fact that in Rex Lake Delta, usually we have very high spring floods. So here in this graph, you can see in the red line, that's a recorded discharge in 2 weeks of the spring in March. And that corresponds with also low vegetation, because in the spring, the vegetation is still kind of waking up after the winter. And so the vegetation biomass is relatively low. And the low connectivity then is more like a medium discharge, which is here around 2,000 cubics per second. And then we will have high vegetation density as we have in the summer. So over the summer, we will have denser vegetation, but lower discharge. And so to simplify this, we classify the vegetation into 3 classes instead of different species, like just shown in the plots before. So we know that we have the highest successional stages, so the subtidal elevation at the tips of these islands here, like in the sketch before, and then towards the inner islands, we get intertidal and subtidal vegetation. And so we assign these classes in our model and associate different densities with them, but the classes stay the same, just to mimic the spring and fall scenario for the different connectivity. And so I use several types of models, but this study specifically is working with Rex Lake Delta. And we have a calibrated hydrodynamic model for a spring and a fall simulation, which is 14 days long. And that model is called ANUGA. For those of you who have worked with this, it's a model that comes from Australia, and it's open source, so it's easy to work with that model and change it. It's written in Python. And there's no sediment transport or morphology in that model yet. So this is just the hydrodynamics. And so in order to assess where now inorganic sediment will go, we are using a simplified approach where we couple this model with basically a particle tracking model using Lagrangian transport. But basically we are seeding particles at the top of the delta, and then with the flow velocities, we track them and see where they can enter the islands and where they will just leave into the ocean. And we can approximate sediment transport through this approach because this Lagrangian transport model links sediment transport with the water depth in the channel and the water depth on the islands. And basically it assumes that at the low, in the depth of the channel at the very bottom, that's where most of the larger particles are being transported. So that will be gravel or sand. And once you're higher up in the water column, you get more wash load. And so mud or other floating like plastics or silt or clay, they will be transported at the top of the water column. And so based on this gradient in the water depth, we assume that particles are more likely to enter the wetlands when they're higher up in the water column than when they're lower in the channel. And that approximates the transport of sand and mud in the delta. And this approach has been validated by Kyle Wright, which was a PhD student at UT Austin. And he showed also that this corresponds well with a Rouge profile, so we can approximate the sediment transport through this approach. And so we seed a bunch of particles for 14 days, almost 250,000 particles, and then we look at the two connectivity scenario, high versus low, and assess where the particles will be going. And so these are the simulations, high connectivity on the left, low connectivity on the right, and the yellow particles are the sand, and the brown particles are the mud. And so you can see on the left that the particles, they're really rushing through the delta. So they are not sticking around very long. They can enter the islands through overbank flow and some of these islands, but they're basically kind of washed out of the system pretty quickly. While on the right-hand side, the particles stick around much longer. So they are being seeded at the top, and they can enter the islands, but most of the entrance of the islands is because the tides are going back and forth, and they're basically pushing all the particles from the sea into the inner island, and therefore nourish the island more from the seaside than from the river. And so we can assess now the portion of particles that are actually entering the islands for the two scenarios. So we do have here the high connectivity scenario for mud and sand. And the colors here indicate the relative fraction of particles that nourish each grid cell of the model. So basically, if you have yellow, it means that some particles can enter that area, but not so many. And if you have red, it means that almost all the particles enter that area. So in this case, we see that the mud basically can be transferred almost all the areas, while the sand is more focused towards the outer edge of the delta. If we compare this with the low connectivity, again for the mud and the sand, we find that not all the areas of the delta can be nourished anymore because the vegetation occupies these higher elevations at the tips of the islands, so the particles cannot enter there. But there is one interesting observation here, and that is if you focus at the inner islands here, those areas are darker than in the high connectivity scenario. So that means that although the particles do not enter the entire island, they are being more focused and they enter the inner islands. So they can actually locally nourish the inner islands more than in the high connectivity scenario. That was kind of an interesting observation, showing that although high connectivity leads to higher nourishment, it means that because it's river dominated, the particles might not enter as much into the inner islands than in a tide dominated, calmer environment where the sediment can just go in and out of the island. And so I'm interested in inorganic versus organic production. So we talked about the inorganic supply and then the organic accretion. And so we're doing a first order estimation on where in the delta we will get organic accretion and how much. And we do this using an empirical soil growth model that has been recently developed. That is a very complicated model. It kind of incorporates a lot of parameters of vegetation. So which type of vegetation, how fast do the roots grow, how fast do they decompose, how much above ground litter production do we have. And those values are validated from field data for the 3 vegetation classes that we have in our hydrodynamic model. So the sub, inter, and subvertidal vegetation. And so on the right, you see the results of the map. So for each vegetation class, we get a different rate of annual organic accretion or average annual organic accretion. And we expected that the higher up, where we have the later successional stages, we have more organic accretion, while we have less organic accretion into the inner islands. So that makes sense. But now we would like to know if we normalize those, do we have areas that are more likely being nourished by the organic accretion or by the inorganic supply that we just saw in the hydrodynamic model for the 2 connectivity scenarios? So basically, we would like to know in each grid cell, is it more likely that there is organic supply or inorganic supply that drives accretion or nourishment of that cell? And so we normalize all of these 3 processes by itself. So we have here relative organic accretion with the maximum accretion that we saw in the higher supertidal elevations, and the inorganic supply also normalized by itself, like we just saw in the previous simulations. And so from these areas, we can derive a potential dominance of these 3 factors. And so for the high and low connectivity scenario, these are areas where the relative proportion of the nourishment by the organic model is denoted as green, while the muddy sediments are the orange areas. And so they look pretty similar for the 2 connectivity scenarios, especially at the areas close to the apex of the deltas or at the edges of the islands. But in the inner islands, we actually get a difference between the 2. And that's because of this control by the river discharge versus the control by the tidal discharge. And if we subtract the 2, so if we look at areas that shift from a dominance of inorganic to organic or vice versa, we get here a difference map. So everything that's green means that during the low connectivity scenario, we actually get areas that become dominated by organic supply. Brown areas are areas that become dominated by inorganic sediment supply between the 2 high connectivity scenarios. And though the ones that become green are usually the ones that are the channels, the tidal channels on the island, while the brown areas are mostly located in the center of the island. So basically similar to what we just saw in the simulations. So this is preliminary work and ongoing. But the first things that we found is that the inorganic supply to Rex Lake Delta depends on the connectivity, especially that the inner islands depend on if we have tide dominated conditions or if we have overbank flow through discharge dominated conditions. And we had the surprising finding that the inner islands actually get nourished more during low connectivity scenario because of the tidal influence. And then the organic supply dominates at the higher elevations, independent of the connectivity scenario. So the vegetation is really one of the dominant factors at the edges of the islands. So that was more or less the first research question that I'm interested in. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we have been starting now with my students to model, to try to reproduce vegetation distribution and establishment in deltas to assess how vegetation affects the geomorphic change over longer time scales. And so this is a map of Rex Lake Delta. We have on the left-hand side bed level changes from the river to the sea, showing that there are changes in bed elevation in the vegetated parts, but the largest changes are actually occurring closer to the sea. And this is related to different vegetation species growing in the delta that we cannot capture with the simplified model that I just showed. So the map in the middle shows the different species from multispectral imagery. And so ideally, we would, instead of having the 3 classes that we used, we would be able to reproduce these different species and their organic accretion and their effect on the morphology, including the seasonal variations between the spring and the winter, and also between years where the vegetation grows. And so in order to be able to do that, we would like to be able to represent dynamic vegetation, so not just the static vegetation. And so in most of the models, and also in the one I just presented, we have this linear directional effect, unidirectional effect, where the vegetation has an ecosystem engineering effect, which would be the friction effects on the flow and the organic accretion, and that will affect the morphology, and that's it. But we argue that in order to have the whole feedback between the vegetation and the morphology, we actually need dynamic vegetation that also responds to the changes in morphology. So if we have the vegetation, we have the ecosystem engineering effect, which might be deposition or erosion that affects the morphology and also the hydrodynamics associated with the morphology, and that will affect the habitat of the species, and therefore the species will respond, and that will change the ecosystem engineering effect, etc. And especially if you look at longer time scales where we look at vegetation establishment and growth with time, we will want to try to represent this feedback to actually be sure that our vegetation acts in a natural way. And so I did something like this in my PhD in the Netherlands. That's quite some time ago, but I used a model that can capture this biogeomorphic feedback loop to assess vegetation establishment in estuaries. And the model was able to reproduce vegetation pattern quite well in a calibrated model, Delft 3D in this case, which is a very sophisticated physics-based model that has the shallow water equation, sediment transport, and morphology. And so we were able to reproduce this vegetation pattern without calibrating the model, the vegetation model. So we just put in information from the literature on how salt marsh would behave, and we were able to get this pattern. And so my idea was that I'm just going to do this in deltas, no problem. And so, well, of course there are problems, but I get to that a little later. But basically how the dynamic model works is that we have establishment, growth, and mortality in a MATLAB code, and that is based on an initial seedling that establishes and then grows over time in height and in diameter, which will change the biomass, and then it can also die and reduce its biomass over time and also over space. And so we couple this with Delft 3D. So as I just said, this is a hydromorphic dynamic model, and we couple this in a way to represent this biogeomorphic feedback loop that I just showed you. So we provide habitat to the MATLAB model, through inundation and flow velocities and bed level changes, and those are rooted in the literature. So if the literature says that a certain species can survive between 0.2 and 0.4% of the time that an area is inundated, then we will tell the model to put our vegetation there. And then our vegetation will respond. So it will establish, it will grow with time, or it might die, depending on if the habitat is suitable or not. And then it will induce the ecosystem engineering effect, which in this case will be the hydraulic roughness on the Delft3D model. And so in this way, we reproduce this biogeomorphic feedback loop, where we have a loop where the vegetation responds, then the morphology responds, and the vegetation responds, etc. And in that way, we were able to reproduce this realistic pattern in the Dutch estuary that I just showed you. However, we've just recently started applying this to deltas, and it becomes a bit more complicated. And so this is just something that we just did this month. So this is very preliminary, but just to give you an idea what my research interests are and where my group is heading to. So we use an idealized Wexlake delta model. Idealized means that we do not calibrate a model based on existing sediment transport rates or flow velocities, but we do have a supply of sediment and a discharge here at the river inlet. We have tides coming in, and this is our tidal basin, basically our delta basin. And these, the slope of the basin, the sediment, and the water are related to what we know from Wexlake delta. So it's the same order of magnitude. And so we will reproduce a delta that is similar or behaves similar to the one that to Wexlake delta. And so I just show you.
Muriel,
Yes.
can I just give you 2 minutes so we have to wrap up?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Anastasia. Great.
Yes, thank you. And so basically we just have the delta that develops here based on these parameters. And then we can assess how the morphology changes if we change different behavior at the upstream end with the river or the tides. And then we can contrast this with the simulation with my vegetation model, where the green areas here are the vegetation. And this is a much shorter simulation because it hasn't finished yet. But we get this characteristic establishment of vegetation at the edges of the islands, where in the inner islands, we do not have as much vegetation. Yes, that was from me. I just put some questions here that we could discuss later, or that I'm just interested in answering. So how can we, how does connectivity affect vegetation establishment, and how does vegetation affect the hydrodynamics and deposition? And then also what is with different species, and how does it affect nutrient transport? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Muriel. I think because I probably ran a little bit late at the beginning, we're a little behind schedule. So
no worries. I can't see anything. I just see my presentation, so I don't know how much I talk. I'm sorry. Apologies if that was a bit
fantastic.
long.
Yeah, it was great to hear your work. But I think we'll maybe save questions until after Anastasia's talk and have a group discussion.
Sounds good. Great.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we can try to get to them later. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Anastasia, are you ready to present and share screen?
Sorry, thanks for accommodating my lateness.
No problem. Welcome.
All right, can you see this okay, Marissa?
Yeah, that looks fantastic.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm Anastasia Pillouras. I'm an assistant professor at Penn State. And I'm going to talk about some of our work that we've been doing over the last like 6 or 7 years to understand Arctic deltas, and really we're trying to understand their role in modulating land ocean fluxes. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we've been doing, and then I'm going to focus on 2 specific things that are more like ongoing work. And I'm going to say we a lot, and really this is work done by these two students, Claire Hines and Selma Oregon. Okay, so for those new to the Arctic, I'm hiding my floating meeting controls. Okay, for those new to the Arctic, you can see a map here of the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean is relatively small. It holds only about 1% of the world's seawater, but it receives more than 10% of the world's river discharge. So rivers have a disproportionately large impact on the Arctic Ocean. And over time, these large Arctic rivers have even contributed to a slight warming and freshening of the Arctic Ocean basin. So in this map, you can see the Arctic Ocean at the center, and then we have a number of really large watersheds and large rivers that drain the northern slopes of continents, pumping lots of water, sediments, nutrients, and heat into this relatively small Arctic Ocean basin. But we know that rivers are not pipes, right? And so they interact with the landscapes around them, and at the mouths of rivers sit river deltas. And I'm going to show the same figure that Muriel showed, which is great, from Matt Hyatt's paper, that really nicely demonstrates some of the different transport pathways that water and its constituents can take through a delta. So as you have water coming in through the channels of a delta, right, it can of course be exchanged through some of these secondary channels, moving into wetlands and lakes. You could have unidirectional or bidirectional flow through those channels. You could have overbank flow and leaking like we just heard about. And all of this is going to change the transport pathways and therefore the timescales of water and its constituents moving through these systems. So that'll have an impact on things like residence time, affecting nutrient loads, sediment deposition, of course, which is then going to also impact coastal turbidity in the coastal ocean. And then even though these systems we think of as net depositional, right, they do also erode their banks as well. And as I'll talk about later, this could have an impact on things like carbon export. So overall, we think about deltas as potentially altering the timing, the location, and even the magnitude of these land and ocean fluxes that can really affect climate and marine ecosystems. And understanding those pathways then is really important, but also requires us to then understand the morphologies and the dynamics of deltas. So again, a similar figure that you've seen. I think most of us on this call have seen many versions of this Galloway diagram, but we can think of rivers or of deltas in this river wave tide space, where the balance of these forces controls the dynamics and the processes and the morphologies of these systems. But I would say that climate, of course, also is going to have an impact. Climate can, of course, affect the balance of these drivers as things like the wave climate changes over time, but it can also affect the local conditions that impact the deltas themselves. And at high latitudes, we have these really unique variables of permafrost and ice cover. So permafrost, if you're not familiar, is generally, we can think of it as frozen ground, but technically it's any ground that remains below 0 degrees C for at least 2 years. For our purposes, we're going to assume it's frozen. So this map on the left is a map of near surface permafrost in Alaska. And you can see I've highlighted the locations of the Yukon Delta here on the left and the Colville Delta on the top, which are two of the deltas I'm going to talk about today. And so you can see that there's permafrost underlaying a large portion of Alaska. The Yukon Delta is technically subarctic, so there's not nearly as much permafrost here, though its watershed, which is a lot of central interior Alaska, is definitely containing lots of permafrost. And then the Colville Delta up here on the North Slope, this is a high Arctic environment, really entirely underlain by near surface permafrost. And we need to understand what impact that frozen ground has on the morphology and dynamics of these systems to understand how they serve as that coastal conduit for river fluxes. Then on the right-hand side of this slide, this is part of a Landsat scene of the Lena Delta in Siberia, which we'll also look at a little bit today. And all this bright blue that you see is ice and snow. So this is a beautiful cloud-free image from June of 2015 that was actually captured on the day of peak discharge in the Lena River. And so even in June, on the day of peak discharge, this system is still largely frozen. There is an ice cover on large portions of the system that we need to understand how it's going to impact those land-ocean fluxes, how it impacts the morphodynamics of river deltas. So this is something we've been working on for a little while. And one of the key features that permafrost really adds to these systems is its effect on lake cover on the deltas. So here I'm showing 6 of the major Arctic deltas that we're going to focus on, the Colville and the Yukon here in figure D. These are the Alaskan deltas I showed. And we've got some Siberian deltas, which are the Lena, the Kolyma, and the Yenisei here on the right, and the Mackenzie delta, this is figure E. But in this image, I'm showing you where we've mapped all of the lakes that cover these systems. And so these are permafrost features. They're called thermokarst lakes. And you can see that on like the Colville and the Mackenzie in particular, about a quarter of the land surface is covered by thermokarst lakes. So this is a real opportunity or potential for storage when we think about sediments moving through these systems, possibly being able to settle in the lakes, or nutrients moving through these systems, where you then could have a lot of channel lake exchange. So this is a clear permafrost feature on these systems that's not in our sort of traditional view of river deltas. A little bit more detailed on that, we could look at just the lakes that are connected to the channels. So showing just kind of the end member cases here for high connectivity and low connectivity, where the Colville Delta on the left has lots of connected lakes that are now just in green. The Yenisei Delta has very few connected lakes. The point here just being that some of these systems like the Colville and the Mackenzie, not only do they have a lot of lakes covering the delta, but those lakes are also structurally connected to the channel network, meaning that when we think about flow through these systems, we need to consider not just flow through the channel networks, but also flow through these connected channel lake networks as well. So that's a clear permafrost signature in these systems. We've also done some modeling of these deltas to try to understand the effects of ice and permafrost, both separately and then also in combination. And this is work that was done with Rebecca Lozon a couple of years ago. So this is a video of Delta RCM. It's a reduced complexity cellular automata style model where we added in the effects of ice and permafrost. It's kind of flashing strobe light, and the upper right is the time series of ice thickness. And then the bottom right is the permafrost developing as the delta is developing, which you can see the topography in the upper left. And so by adding in ice and permafrost to this model, we were able to find that ice and permafrost both really limit channel mobility in deltas. They make deeper entrenched channels that stay in place over long periods of time. So that's going to have an impact, of course, on how these systems grow and how they convey fluxes to the coast. And then also really importantly, that ice cover in particular, fundamentally changes the depositional patterns of delta. So it fundamentally changed the balance of onshore versus offshore deposition, favoring more deposition on the top set, but then also funneling sediments farther out past the shoreline, but overall driving slower shoreline propagation. So this tells us that, ice and permafrost are having some really fundamental effects on the behaviors and morphologies of these systems, particularly in how sediments are moving through Arctic deltas. So with that sort of introduction, I want to focus today in the remaining time on these 2 questions here, which are 2 projects that we have kind of ongoing in our group. The first is understanding how deltas, and Arctic deltas in particular, influence the transport and storage of suspended sediments from the river to the ocean. And the second is how Arctic delta channel networks are changing and what influence that might also have on carbon transport. So I'm going to start with the suspended sediments. We're interested in understanding how suspended sediment is moving through these systems, how much might get trapped. We're going to focus again on these 6 deltas that you can see here with their watersheds delineated. Again, we have the Mackenzie here in Canada, just to orient you. This is the Yukon and Colville in Alaska on the bottom. And then on the top part of the figure, you can see our Siberian deltas, the Kolyma, the Lena, and the Yenisei. Also on this map, you can see that we've got blue dots where there are stream gauges measuring flow in the rivers. And then there are these beige dots. Some of them overlap with the blue dots, but these beige dots that show the locations where the Arctic Great Rivers Observatory takes samples. So the Arctic Great Rivers Observatory has done a really wonderful job of monitoring these rivers, taking water samples and measuring for our purposes. We'll talk about total suspended solids, but they also measure solutes in these rivers. So we have a sense of what's actually coming out of these watersheds. But hopefully you notice that the gauges and the sampling sites are typically upstream of the deltas. So these black boxes that you can see in the figure are the locations of the deltas themselves. And all of the sampling and gauging is all really upstream of the deltas. So that tells us what's coming out of the watershed. It doesn't really tell us what's actually making it to the coast because we don't know what happens across these really large and complex landscapes. So we're going to use the stream gauge information and the total suspended solids information from Arctic Grow to basically drive a model, a new model, to understand what happens to suspended sediment as it moves through these landscapes. And we're doing this with a network-based model. So we start with a binary mask of the channel network. This is the binary mask of the Mackenzie Delta on the left. From that, we extract the channel center lines, which you can see this figure on the right in blue, and then can also identify the nodes where we have bifurcations and confluences in the channel network. And then we basically model the transport of information from node to node down this network. In our case, the information is generally about suspended sediment concentration and suspended sediment fluxes, where we can input some suspended sediment and discharge at the upstream nodes, and look at how that information changes until we get a suspended sediment flux at each of the outlet nodes all along the delta shoreline. And so I'll just sort of walk you through in words how we construct this model with this little schematic here on the left. So we have some input upstream suspended sediment concentration that comes in at an upstream node. That's then split or partitioned between two different channels based on the relative widths of the channels at the bifurcation. And then water leaks out of the channels, as we just heard about in a really great talk. So it leaks out of the channels, water and sediment leaking out of the channels into the islands with this leakiness formulation that Claire devised, where the leakiness basically depends on the water surface slope on the delta relative to the land surface slope. And it changes depending on the discharge in the river, whether or not there's ice, which encourages more leakiness, and then also how far you are from the inlet. So you get leakier as you go downstream. So we leak water and sediment into the wetlands, and then we also erode or deposit sediment in the channels based on some really simple threshold-based transport rules that are kind of built on the transport of delta RCM. So we have simple like velocity thresholds for settling, for example. Then we also trap some sediment in the wetlands based on some sort of trapping efficiency. So this is largely dependent on vegetation patterns where we look at how NDVI changes over time. And then also depends on discharge, where faster discharges can kind of flush things out, and lower discharges would support more trapping. We also divert a portion of that discharge into the lakes. So the lakes are really important, right? And if you have more lakes, you have more opportunity to trap sediments in them. And we make a trapping efficiency in the lakes that's based on some data for sediment accumulation rates in lakes in the Mackenzie River Delta. And then once we've determined, how much sediment is staying basically out of the channels, we can calculate a residual suspended sediment concentration in each link, and then pass that down to the downstream nodes and links. And this is repeated on each of these individual links and nodes, moving all the way down the delta network until we get to these outlet nodes at the coast to determine what the actual outlet flux is. And I'm going to show you really just two main results from this today. The first is this time series. So we're operating on a monthly time step in this case. So you can see the results for all 6 deltas here. The green lines with the squares are what is coming into the delta. So that's data from Arctic Grow, averaged over the period of record to a monthly timescale. And you can see that generally for these systems, we get a maximum incoming suspended sediment in June when we get the spring snowmelt flood, and then the rest of the year it's pretty low. The exception is the Yukon that has a more continuous high incoming suspended sediment concentration. And then the blue dash lines with the circles are what's actually coming out of the delta shoreline based on outlet. So it's the sum across all of those outlet nodes. And you can see that this kind of tracks the pattern for the most part of what's coming into the delta, right? So you have a higher flux coming in June and a higher flux coming out in June relative to the other months. But we are trapping some amount of that sediment in the deltas. And then there are some deltas in some months where we see that the lines are actually flipped, where perhaps we're exporting more than we're importing, meaning that there could be a period of time where the incoming sediment concentration is just so low that the deltas are maybe a little bit net erosion. But overall, we find that these systems are net storing a lot of the incoming suspended sediments. with the amount that's stored ranging from about 14% to 65%. So possibly 65% of the incoming suspended sediments being trapped within the delta itself, meaning that 65% of the incoming sediments not being delivered to the coastal ocean. So this bar chart on the right shows you the actual values of the net storage with some uncertainty based on model parameters. And the table gives you the actual numbers for inputs and outputs. And what we generally find is that what fraction of the sediments are stored depends to some extent on the incoming amount of suspended sediment. So rivers that have higher suspended sediment concentrations seem to trap more of that sediment. The larger deltas also seem to trap more of that sediment. So systems like the Lena and the Mackenzie, which are quite large, and Yukon trap a lot of sediment, perhaps because there's just longer transport pathways within the delta, more opportunity for channel island exchange compared to the smaller systems that have kind of simpler networks. And then there's also some dependence on the hydrograph. So this figure on the left is showing you the hydrographs for these rivers normalized from 0 to 1. And what we have found is that the systems that are really flashy, like this orange line, which is the Yenisei, if they're really flashy, meaning they've got a fast rise and a fast fall, there's not really enough opportunity for leaking to be able to store a lot of that sediment compared to systems that have a more gradual fall or kind of spend more time at these moderate discharges. But overall, we can say that the Arctic deltas are storing a really significant amount of the incoming suspended sediments, and that the large deltas in particular, with these kind of less flashy hydrographs and high incoming suspended sediment, seem to store the most amount of sediment. Okay, so we're storing a lot of incoming suspended sediment. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what happens if we consider that these channel networks aren't static. So we're assuming at this point they're static. And how do the changes in the channel networks affect the export in particular of soil organic carbon in the Arctic? And carbon is a really important part of the Arctic story. So this map on the upper right is showing you soil organic carbon content for northern permafrost soils, where we've got 1,500 gigatons of carbon stored in these soils, which I believe is more than the carbon that's currently held in the atmosphere. So we've got all these large watersheds, right, draining into the Arctic Ocean, but what they're draining is a lot of carbon-rich permafrost. And again, Arctic Grow has done a really wonderful job of taking measurements and allowing us to understand what the actual carbon export is from these watersheds. So they've measured particulate organic carbon in tons per year. In the first column you see here in the table, they've also got dissolved organic carbon. We could sum that to just get a total organic carbon and get a sense of what's coming out of these rivers. But again, those measurements are upstream of the deltas, right? And on the deltas, even though we consider that they're net depositional, they can trap a lot of that incoming sediment, they also can erode. So here's an example on the Yukon where we've got a bank delineated in 1985. And then this image in 2022 shows us that there's anywhere from 200 to 400 meters of bank erosion in that roughly 40-year period. So we want to look at how this bank erosion and how the channels migrate can actually affect the export or potential export of soil organic carbon from these systems, given that we have these really carbon-rich permafrost soils. So we're going to return to our 6 big deltas that we like to look at. We're looking at Landsat late summer imagery for all of these systems where we can classify land, channels, and lakes. And that's the classification that you're seeing here in this figure. And then use basically the oldest available cloud-free Landsat image that we can find to a more modern image, which at the time we first started doing this was around 2014 to 2016 to calculate rates of erosion. And then assuming some sort of channel depth and given the soil organic carbon content of the soils, we can estimate a resulting SOC flux from each of these systems based on their erosion. So in terms of erosion rates, we see erosion rates in these systems generally around 1 meter a year. So the average linear erosion rate's around 1 meter a year. The eroded area is considerably higher on the Lena Delta, about 10 square kilometers per year, than the other systems, which are more around 1 square kilometer per year. We've separated the erosion rates in these CDFs in the top part of the slide between the sort of inland parts of the delta on the left and then the nearshore area, the nearshore here being areas within 5 channel widths of the shoreline, basically showing that for some of these systems, like the Colville and the Lena in particular, we do get higher rates of erosion near the shoreline compared to more of the interior of the delta along the channel. So the Colville image here in the upper right also shows an example of that, where we get a lot of shoreline retreat in red, where the shoreline is retreating back and eroding over time. But a lot of these systems, we mostly see, focused bank erosion, particularly around bends, like we show here and on the other slide on the Yukon. In terms of the carbon, this is giving you an example of the carbon contents on the Mackenzie Coloma, so you can see what that looks like in space relative to the channel networks. But on average, they all have kind of a similar soil organic carbon content across the whole delta. So they're all kind of around 60 kilograms per square meter. The exception here being the Mackenzie, where the value is a little bit lower. And we do consider in the calculations I'm going to show you, we do consider, the spatial variability, like what actually eroded on the channels, what was the carbon content of what actually eroded. But since the averages are all kind of about the same, I would assume then that the SOC fluxes are mostly going to be a function of how much erosion occurs, with the caveat that if a delta is, preferentially eroding into really high carbon content areas, then it could throw off that relation. But what we find is that they generally scale with each other. So here you've got a plot of SOC eroded per year versus the eroded area per year for these 6 systems. And we see that there's some sort of relationship between them, with, of course, the Lena up here kind of driving a lot of that line. So the Lena is eroding very fast, meaning that it's potentially exporting also a lot of the soil organic carbon as it's eroding into those carbon-rich soils. If we sum all of these up, the total SOC export from these 6 deltas alone, which are only 6 of many deltas in the Arctic, exceeds 2.5 million metric tons per year. And if you remember those numbers that I showed you earlier slide from Arctic Grow, where they're measuring the particulate organic carbon, which perhaps is most comparable to SOC, the particulate organic carbon just coming out of the rivers is 2.6 million tons per year. So what we're eroding on the deltas is basically the same amount as what is being measured coming out of the rivers, which is potentially a really large observational gap. I'll give the caveat that this is, of course, the upper limit of the estimate of what might be coming out of the deltas, because we're not yet considering deposition within the delta. So just what's eroding is perhaps on par with what's coming out of the watersheds. We can map deposition over that 30 to 40 year time period with remote sensing, but we can't really map the new carbon content of those new deposits. So for now, we're just sticking with this sort of upper estimate. You can look at this a slightly different way. If we assume that the total organic carbon flux to the coast is the sum of what's coming out of the rivers, the POC, and what's coming out of the eroded delta SOC, then we can see in which the relative contributions basically of the river versus the delta to that total flux. And on the Lena and the Yenisei, you can see the size of the orange bar is greater than the size of the blue bar, right? Meaning that the delta is potentially contributing more carbon than what's being measured in the river, depending, of course, on subsequent deposition. And this table just shows the same thing, that the ratio of delta SOC to river POC is greater than 1 on the Lena and the Yenisei. So again, potentially a large observational gap where we don't really understand how much carbon is coming out of these systems if we're only measuring carbon upstream of the deltas. So overall, this tells us that, considering eroded SOC in the deltas potentially increases POC fluxes to the coast. Now you might be wondering, well, could POC fluxes actually be lower than what's measured in the rivers? And the answer is, of course, yes, possibly, right? I just gave a whole half of this talk on how these deltas trap a lot of the incoming suspended sediments. But determining that would require us to understand a lot more details about the flooding and the storage in these systems, transport pathways, the carbon contents of new deposits, and where the carbon is actually going once it passes the shoreline. A lot of these systems have a nearshore ramp, a shallow subaqueous ramp that extends the delta for kilometers beyond what the shoreline we can see in remote sensing. And if carbon's just getting directly buried in that ramp, then that's another piece of the puzzle, but something that we can't resolve with remote sensing or modeling. And so moving forward, we need to also determine then how accretion in these systems is balancing erosion and what influence that might have on SOC fluxes. And so I'm going to end by, similar to Muriel, just asking a series of questions, things that I'm thinking about, things that I think are really important to understand in these systems to characterize their modern morphologies and behaviors, but also think about how they're going to change in the future. So the kind of big picture overarching question that I like to think about is how much sediment, carbon, other nutrients, or even heat is actually being delivered to the coastal ocean. How accretion, of course, is offsetting erosion and what that means for permafrost carbon transport. How connectivity in these systems changes over time. I'm showing an image here of connected lakes in the Mackenzie Delta, where you can see that some of those lakes are clearly more connected than others based on their turbidities, but how are those connectivities changing seasonally or longer term as the permafrost thaws? And how will those lake patterns overall change as the Arctic warms? Something more complicated that I've thought about and haven't even tried to tackle is how sea level rise in particular is going to affect permafrost thaw and subsidence as some of these systems become inundated with salt water and what that may do to the overall landscape. And then finally, how vegetation change in these systems as the Arctic warm is also going to affect things like bank cohesion and aggradation and sediment transport. So I will end there, and yeah, happy to take questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for a great talk, Anastasia. I have lots of questions, but I will definitely open it up to the rest of the audience. Thanks everyone who was able to stay. I think we can have people unmute if they have questions, or you can feel free to write questions in the chat and I will read them out to Muriel and Anastasia.
Muriel, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask a question first? Or I can ask a question.
Go ahead, Julia.
Okay, I'm gonna go ask a question. I was curious, one of the things that, and this Anastasia's talk made me think about it, but Muriel, feel free to jump in. One of the things I think about when I'm thinking about organic carbon and nutrient export through deltas on the ocean side is the timing of that input. Like, so rivers have a pretty strong seasonal, freshet pattern. And then I was wondering if you could say something about the timing of when this organic matter might be released from the edge erosion of the deltas.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think the permafrost bank erosion is a little complicated, right? Because there's a heat component to that. And so, early on in the season, when things are pretty frozen, you might get the spring flood coming down, and if that's bringing a bunch of ice with it, the ice could definitely cause a good amount of erosion of the permafrost carbon. So you could get some sort of pulse earlier on when the discharge is high. But then I would expect that you would get a good amount of delivery of it also later in the season, because the water is going to be warmer, meaning you're going to have a higher heat flux from the water into the bank. The air is going to be warmer, so you'll also get some thermodenudation going on. I don't know that I can give you a it all comes in June type of answer. But I would expect that there is definitely some time varying input where you might get, let's say you probably get a pulse of it with the spring flood, because that's just a really dramatic time that can flush stuff out. And then you might get some of the bank, I would guess, would get eroded later in the season, but you might not be able to transport it out until you get a slightly higher discharge event from a late summer rainstorm that we tend to see in some of these hydrographs. So you might get kind of pulsed inputs based on the hydrology, but that's going to be different for something like the Yukon, where you just have a more consistent flow, and then you're just kind of getting it all through the open water season. But for the really high latitude systems, I would guess it's a little pulsed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So a lot of it would, yeah, okay. So I'm sort of thinking a lot of it might still come out with the spring freshet, just because that's when you're getting the pulse, if something's not exactly on the coast.
Yeah, I think you're still gonna get stuff in the spring freshet, because stuff's coming out of the out of the watershed, right? And just the volume of flow is a component of that heat flux, right? Even though the water is kind of cold. And then later in the season, like the water will be really warm, but if the water level is really low, then you won't necessarily have enough erosive power or transport capacity. So it's probably like, if we think about like an effective discharge in geomorphology, there's probably some effective discharge for permafrost bank erosion that's slightly different because it balances like the thermal and mechanical components of that. And so the answer is probably like not June, but it's probably July, something like that. It's if I had to guess.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to Bob.
Up. I can't seem to, no, there we go.
There you are.
Thank you. I really enjoyed both presentations, and one of my comments would be that both of you emphasize the subaerial region of deltas, and Anastasia, you did comment on the subaqueous portion, but I'm wondering if you could comment on what are the factors that determine the relative percentage of the sedimentary storage that is subaerial versus subaqueous in these systems.
Sure, I can take a crack at that, and Muriel can say other things that might be different. So at least in the ice covered systems, we do see that as you get an ice thickness that approaches the water depth in the receiving basin, that's when you start to develop this sort of ramp beyond the delta in a way that also significantly influences that subaqueous component. And so, we see that when we start to get the, ice thicknesses sort of 3 to 4 meters in a 5 meter water depth receiving basin, that's when we start funneling a lot of sediment beyond that subaerial shoreline that we can see. But then for any amount of ice that's covering the delta while it's starting to flood, that ice encourages more overbank flooding because you're sort of putting a lid on the delta that's sort of setting up the water surface up there. So in terms of how much subaerial deposition you're getting, that seems to be impacted just by like, is there any ice? Versus if you have, thicker ice, that's when you're starting to be able to change the subaqueous distribution of sediments as well. And so like the Yukon Delta, for example, has this really nice, they call it the 2 meter ramp, beyond the shoreline, where you've got a couple tens of kilometers of subaqueous delta, right, that you can't really see in remote sensing, but that does seem to be formed by the presence of ice, bedfast ice and shorefast ice at the shore. Did I sort of answer your question? I got part of it, maybe.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I'm not sure what the tidal characteristics of the systems you're working in are. Would you turn them macrotidal or microtidal or?
Yeah, very, very small. The
okay,
Yukon might have a slightly higher tide, but we sort of ignore tides because they can be pretty small for most of these systems, maybe excepting some of the estuarine ones.
So both of you are working in microtidal systems, like coastlines, and is that going to influence this ratio that you feel, or that would influence the partitioning between subaerial and subaqueous in any of these, or is it largely independent of that and related to things like what you just mentioned, ice characteristics in the high latitudes, but obviously not in the subtropics? So anyway.
Well, I would think that the delta would look very different if you had a higher tidal influence. So instead of having this protruding channel network that is driven by avulsions, I think you would have more like an inland facing delta. So I think maybe it's hard to just say there's more tides so that ratio changes. I just wanted to add for the Wax Lake Delta, I think it's very important what type of sediment you have. Most of the subaqueous delta is sandy. So these are all sandy deposits, and then you get like muddy deposits further outwards. at the edges of the sandy deposits. And with time, we have this buildup of the bars. And then at some point when they reach the top, basically, in the water surface, then the mud and the vegetation that comes in kind of builds the upper part of the delta. So I think it has to do with the ratio of what types of sediment do we have in the delta to kind of assess how much do we actually get built up on top of mean water.
Thank you.
That's my 2 cents.
All right. Does anyone else have questions they want to share? I guess going on this topic of subaerial versus subaqueous deposition, I have a question for Anastasia. Do you think that because that Arctic deltas would have a higher trapping efficiency because of the presence of lakes? And Muriel showed those simulations where a lot of the sediment gets flushed out because you don't necessarily have a lot of depressions where things get trapped. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. My inclination would be to say yes, that if you have more lakes, you could have more trapping just because there's more opportunity for things to settle out. With that will depend though on what the flow is doing, right? Like if you have really high flows and it can just flush everything out, in which case your lakes aren't topographically relevant, right? If they're not actually expressed as lakes, depending on how much leaking you have, then the existence of the lake doesn't matter. But in our case, because we have, these actual formed topographic depressions, and we have flashy hydrographs, we do see that, you have more lakes, you have more trapping. But I guess we could test it with some other hydrographs and see. Yeah.
I have another question. I have a question for Muriel. I normally think about vegetation as impacting like the sediment transport. But this is also, OCB, so I'm thinking about biogeochemical cycling. So I was wondering, are there aspects about biogeochemical cycling that you feel like might help, like when you're thinking about putting more realistic vegetation in your model, like what types of things are you thinking about in terms of like the biogeochemical factors that influence their growth? Or maybe nothing. Maybe it's more just like sea level and temperature and salinity
Yeah.
and sedimentation.
No, I think that's a very good question, because my models are usually just looking at the hydrodynamics and the sediment supply, but we have been thinking a lot about the nutrient aspect. So especially with regard to the connectivity, so how many nutrients, like the plants need nutrients to grow. So how do the nutrients actually enter the islands, and how are they taken up by the vegetation? And then with regard to the carbon, I think I'm really thinking the species are important. That's what my research showed, and some of my colleagues' research showed. So depending on what species you have different types of organic accretion, you have different growth rates, you have different effects on flow and sedimentation. And so that affects the morphology of landforms in general, I would think. And so that also determines how much carbon are you actually able to capture and put into the soils. So this the soil growth model that I presented, I didn't talk about very much, but that can actually, it is coming from a model that has been predicting carbon uptake by mangroves. And so it can be used to estimate how much carbon can we actually incorporate into our soil column with different types of vegetation. And that's something that I don't know very much about, because I have not really thought about the details of the biochemical cycles in vegetation. But I think there's a lot of potential to couple that with the morphodynamics, because the response of the vegetation depends on the hydromorphodynamics and the nutrient supply, which are linked. And those affect how carbon gets stored and how much soil gets built, which is also linked with the previous. So I think there's a lot of potential. Does this answer your question? I went away on a tangent,
Yeah,
maybe.
no, it did. And I don't know much about it, so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, when it comes to biochemical, I know that this model that I showed with the particle tracking, that has been used now at UT by a PhD student of Paola Pasalacqua's group, and she is looking into nutrient supply to the islands and into the biochemical aspects. But she just started with when I left there, so possibly I'm not sure how far she is with this, but you can apply that model also to track how nutrients enter the islands and where they can be where the uptake might be largest, etc. So I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions that we could address.
Thank you.
So I'm going to address a question that was written in the chat. This is for both Anastasia and Muriel. So in the context of Earth system models, you generally can't model at such a high resolution as you both are in terms of deltas and their fluxes. So what are your thoughts on how we can represent these fluxes in Earth system models or larger regional models?
So I can take a crack at that since I work on a Earth system modeling project. So I don't do any Earth system modeling, but I've had this conversation a lot with modelers. So I think there's a couple answers. One is regional models can be really valuable for that. So I work with some folks who work on the RASM, Regional Arctic System model, where you can have, for example, like a 2-kilometer ocean, and you can resolve coastal currents, meaning that the actual spatial distributions of outflows from deltas could matter. So regional models can be really useful for that kind of thing. Same with like regionally refined models, like a Arctic regionally refined version of like E3SM from DOE. But the other more likely answer is that this is part of why I like the network-based modeling, because we can, on our side, we can resolve the actual channel network of the system. We can come up with some sort of simplifications for how flow might move through it, but really use it to basically just make like a transfer function that could perhaps modify what actually comes out of the river, and then give some better insights on like how spreading functions are set on the ocean side of those models, where perhaps, the spreading function would reflect something about the actual outflows in terms of space and time and strength, compared to kind of what's done now, which is not necessarily based on what the delta landscape looks like at all. And so that doesn't really involve super high resolution, particularly for, a lot of the systems that I'm working on where they're 200 or 300 kilometers across. Even if you have a 10-kilometer ocean, the distribution of channels should still inform something about the spreading function for a 300-kilometer delta and a 10-kilometer ocean.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think these reduced complexity models that Anastasia presented, like the Delta RCM or the network model, I actually have a question about this. That is very helpful to just assess the large scale response and get like a qualitative, or I don't want to really use qualitative, but like an kind of a big picture idea of how things are working. And you don't need the small scale processes to resolve this big picture. And I think that is very helpful in just understanding the large scale morphological evolution, which I'm also mostly interested in. But then when we look at the smaller scale, so for example, we would look at a specific marsh that will be restored here in Louisiana, then we really need the details of the vegetation, the details of the different grain sizes, etc., because the small scale processes are the driver of the behavior of the morphology or of the marsh. And yeah, it's very hard to bridge all of them. And I'm not sure if our models would be correcter if we linked all of these processes together. But yeah, I think it really depends on the question, like what Anastasia said. Can I ask a quick question to Anastasia?
Yeah, go ahead.
I love the idea with the network information transfer. I was wondering, maybe I missed it, but how you said that you partition based on the water surface slope. And so I was just curious how you determine the water surface slope in the model, because as far as I understood, you didn't have as hydrodynamic resolved, or is that just an estimate on the bed elevation, or how would that work?
Yeah. So we partitioned in the channel network based on relative widths. But we leak water out based on the water surface slope. So basically, the Mackenzie Delta has gauges actually all throughout the delta, which is really nice. So we can come up with some sort of water surface slope based on that and how it changes monthly. And then we used, it's not the best, but it's what we've got, Arctic DEM, which is like a 2-meter DEM of the delta. So we can get a sense of what does the delta look like. We assume that's large scale, constant in time, but then the water surface slope changes, and that gives us some sense of how much may leak.
Okay, that makes sense. That's great that you have so much data, and I think 2-meter resolution is actually not bad compared to what I'm used to.
2-meter resolution is great. It's the vertical resolution that's bad.
Oh, yeah.
Areas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure. I unfortunately also need to head out. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, no, it is
Great.
over our time, but thank you so much for joining. Both of your talks were really fantastic.
Do we have time for one more question here in the chat from Moses for Muriel? We've got 1 minute.
Muriel, if you have time, any perspectives on altered deltas? So how human activities might affect them and how they can be restored.
Well, I'm a bit supporter of using nature to restore coastlines as much as possible. And I think one of the main reasons why deltas are starving here in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, is because we have the dams that kind of cut off the sediment supply and the levees. So I think if that's the case, I think the most straightforward way would be to make room for the river upstream to enhance sediment supply, maybe take out a dam if you can, while guaranteeing the flood safety, of course. So in the Netherlands, they do that a lot with the coastline, that they have this polder system. So you have like a gate that you can open when there's a storm flood coming that floods like a marsh, and behind the marsh you have a levee that blocks the flow into the inland. So having some systems like this, and they are installing systems like this, I think that's one of the first steps to take. Quick answer to a very broad question.
Yeah, that was great. I think that answered that question. So, all right, well, it's only a couple of us left, so we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Muriel.
Thanks, Marisa.
It was fun. Yeah. Hope to see you in March at the workshop.
Yes, you will. I can promise that.
Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
Right.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.